it's interesting because a letter to political prisoners in Iran was written in English, published in English in a British newspaper. I mean, if they had contacted me, if the CIA had contacted me, I would have said, look, the first publication should be in Farsi, and it should be done in such a way that it looks like you're trying to get it to the Iranian political prisoners, and then afterwards publish it. The original was in Farsi or something like that. But this was not for the. It was actually misaddressed. It's not addressed to Iranian political prisoners. This is actually addressed to Western liberals at a time when people are losing faith in Trump's war, when it looks like the United States has pushed Iran to the threshold of let's say leaving the non-proliferation treaty, when it's pushed Iran and China and Russia into a sense of survival together and so on. At that moment, you need to build some legitimacy for this war. And in this case, it's impossible to say, let's save the Iranian women. They already fired that gun. It's not working anymore. So now suddenly you say, well, let's save the political prisoners.
We do want to sort of bring you into our next segment with our next guest here, Navid. We want to bring in Vijay Prashad. But stay with us, Navid, because we want your take on what we're going to be talking to Vijay about as well. So as you all know, there has been this controversy brewing around this open letter that was published in The Guardian addressed to Iran's political prisoners. It's titled, "To Iran's Political Prisoners Trapped Between Two Blades of Scissors." And if we could put up a screenshot of that, that'd be great. The letter frames Iran's Islamic Republic as caught between two forms of domination, its own carceral state, and the imperialist forces it claims to oppose, and accuses Iran of this hollow anti-imperialism, as they call it, at one point describing it as a system that claims to counter accuses Iran of hollow anti-imperialism, describing it as a system that claims to counter imperial power while using its very logic of domination and systems of carcerality, torture, and execution. The backlash to this letter was immediate. It was signed by a long list of Western academics and activists, including, surprisingly to many, Angela Davis and Mumia Abu-Jamal, Rashid Khaledi, Judith Butler, among others. Since then, some signatories, like the academic Robin D.G. Kelley, have pulled their names. Kelley has said that the circumstances under which he was asked to sign were a bit shady, and that what actually ran in print wasn't exactly what he had seen initially. Now, to dig into this letter, the backlash, and what's really behind it, we are joined by Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, welcome back to BT Live.
Yeah, nice to be with the three of you. Yeah.
It's great to see you again. And Vijay, you wrote a really great response to the letter that was in The Guardian, and we'll get into that. But first, while we have Navid here, Navid, you are in Tehran. You've lived through this U.S.-Israeli war of aggression after watching 2.5 years of genocide in Gaza unfold. What's your reaction to this letter and to the backlash against it?
Yeah, so I'm glad that Vijay is also joining because he had some very intelligent commentary. But before he speaks, I'll tell you my take. I mean, for one, the feeling is that I was disgusted. But I think what is happening here is that the West and Israel are increasingly looking for unconventional strategies to combat Iran because they're seeing that there is large global opposition to this war, and also militarily they have been defeated thus far. So I think they're looking for unconventional strategies, and the Iranian opposition has expired in a sense. The Iranian opposition that we will see in Western countries manufacture consent for this war, people aren't taking them too seriously anymore. And also the Trump administration is not being taken seriously anymore because they've been lying and they've been saying contradictory things about this war and everything in between. So I think what they're doing now is that the West and Israel are drawing on the expired Iranian opposition to persuade non-Iranian leftist academics to come and support this war in a sense. So now they're trying to manufacture consent through leftist intellectuals. And if the idea is that the monarchist, the right-wing Iranian opposition is no longer credible, and the Trump administration is no longer credible, what is better than having these leftist intellectuals endorse the war on Iran? And to be fair, I don't want to straw man, so they didn't endorse the war as such, but what ends up happening is that when you equally condemn both sides of the conflict, the aggressed and the aggressor, what you end up doing is that you help the country that is doing the bombing. And I think what they did, what these academics did, is that they generated consent to the war, and with this open letter, they helped the empire. And the last thing I'll say is that, as you mentioned, Rania, and I think Vijay will have more to say on this, I think the letter failed miserably, and I think this is a really huge turning point, because with the wars before, say with Libya, Syria, Iraq, when the liberal and the left academics would come and say something, it would kind of work when it came to the manufacturing of consent. But in this case, there was such a massive backlash that, as you said, people like Rashid Khaledi and Robin Kelley, they withdrew their signature, even though I don't think the Robin Kelley withdrawal was serious, because he also signed a letter in March of 2026 that condemned Iran for anti-Western rhetoric, and he's still standing by that letter. So I think he just did it because the public backlash was so massive. And not only the letter failed in the West, but it also failed inside Iran. Literally no one read the letter. The political prisoners didn't read it. My friends didn't read it. I read it because I've been educated in the West. I have a PhD from Columbia, so I knew a lot of these people. I studied with them. And that's another reason I'm so disgusted, because I used to take these people seriously and study with them and respect them. But now seeing this, I see, that they're hypocritical and also opportunistic, because in a way they want to tell their Zionist bosses at the Zionist-funded universities that they are in line and they want to keep onto their careers and funding. So in sum, my reaction is disgust, but the letter failed pretty miserably.
So, Vijay, before we get into what you wrote about, well, we do have Navid on speaking to us from Tehran. I'm just curious if there's anything you want to add to what Navid just said.
Well, it's interesting because a letter to political prisoners in Iran was written in English, published in English in a British newspaper. I mean, if they had contacted me, if the CIA had contacted me, I would have said, look, the first publication should be in Farsi, and it should be done in such a way that it looks like you're trying to get it to, the Iranian political prisoners, and then afterwards publish it. The original was in Farsi or something like that. But this was not it was actually misaddressed. It's not addressed to Iranian political prisoners. This is actually addressed to Western liberals. At a time when people are losing faith in Trump's war, when it looks like the United States has pushed Iran to the threshold of let's say leaving the non-proliferation treaty, when it's pushed Iran and China and Russia into a sense of survival together and so on, at that moment you need to build some legitimacy for this war. And in this case, it's impossible to say, let's save the Iranian women. They already fired that gun. It's not working anymore. So now suddenly you say, well, let's save the political prisoners. And let me just say, directly, that the United States has political prisoners as well. One of them, in fact, was supposedly a signatory to this letter. I think he didn't sign the letter. He didn't know about this letter. His name was put on it, and that's Mumia Abu-Jamal, who just recently had a completely different opinion about this war, saying this war is an enormous example for the people of the third world and so on. So I think this is a misaddressed letter. It shouldn't be called to the Iranian political prisoners. It should be called a letter to Western liberals, using the Iranian political prisoners as a way to reinforce your solidarity with Mr. Trump, in fact, rather than solidarity with the prisoners. So that's one side of it. The other ridiculous part of it, and very quickly, is that it's really the case that people sign letters without reading them. It's amazing. What planet are you living on? You have a PhD. Read the letter. Insist on looking at it. And if you were hoodwinked, come out and tell us who hoodwinked you.
So it's interesting. I mean, maybe one day we'll find out that Marco Rubio secretly organized this letter, and that's why he didn't more intelligently write it in Farsi first and address it to actual Iranians. But while we still have you, Navid, I want to ask you about something that you touch on in your piece on this, Vijay. And that is this claim that this letter accuses Iran of what they call hollow anti-imperialism, which is a really interesting phrasing, hollow anti-imperialism, especially at a time when there is so much anti-war sentiment in the U.S. This is the most unpopular war in the history of wars being polled in the U.S., and that's at the beginning of the war. It's only gotten more unpopular since then. And so, like you guys are talking about, it's in English, in an English-speaking outlet addressed to Westerners more than anything else, and it seems to be there to foment confusion, but specifically around the issue of anti-imperialism. And I raise that with you, Navid, because, Tehran has leaned hard into the language of resistance. It's framed itself as this country that's absorbing the cost of standing up to Washington on behalf of the wider region, the sovereignty of the wider region, but also really on behalf of the world. And, when you think of that term, hollow anti-imperialism, as a person sitting in Iran, as an Iranian, does that framing, that the Iranians put out, does it hold up for ordinary Iranians right now, do you think, given everything they're living through day to day? Or does the government's resistance rhetoric feel distanced from people's actual daily hardship? And in other words, is it hollow?
No, it is not hollow. I would say it's probably the most real, the most material expression of anti-imperialism and decolonization that we have in the world right now. And the problem with the Western Academy is, I think, partly because they want to hold on to their funding and careers and be, in line with what the Zionist bosses demand of them. What they have done is that there's this elite capture of decolonization, and they have kind of redefined decolonization as something that happens in the mind. So mentally I can decolonize my mind, or I can decolonize my Netflix choices or my Spotify playlist, or I can put a land acknowledgement under my email saying that I'm sitting on a stolen land. But when it comes to Iran actually assisting the Palestinians to gain back the expropriated lands in a material way, that is hollow anti-imperialism. But somehow writing a land acknowledgement under your emails is real, anti-imperialism. So basically what they're doing, these Western academics, is that they're redefining anti-imperialism to mean something mental and cognitive, or to mean a personal lifestyle or choice, but that is not the case. Anti-imperialism, if you look at historically, it has this material dimension that is a struggle that needs organization, that needs arms, and that's what Iran is doing. Iran, through retaliating against US and Israeli positions, is trying to decolonize the region. So it's trying to maintain and expand its sovereignty, and also help the Arab neighbors and Palestine to become more sovereign.
Well, actually, so I have to ask Vijay, is this the reason you left the academy?
It's not the reason. It's what it is it's to some extent a sense that you don't want to. Okay, let me back up a little bit. I mean, the United States is also the place where elites from different countries flee, and they frequently enter these institutions of higher learning and become your colleagues and so on. So whether it's people from Bangladesh or it's Iran or wherever it is, they come from certain backgrounds, and they have an impact on scholars who are born and raised in the United States. When people say, let's listen to the Iranians, what they mean is, let's listen to the Iranians that I know. And those are Iranians, who fled with the monarchy perhaps, or who decided to flee the country for whatever reason. I don't judge them for fleeing, but they have their own class opinion. And one has to be aware of that. When people say, let's listen to the Syrians, my God, how much I used to listen to that. Let's listen to the Syrians. But there are Syrians with different opinions. What you mean is, who share a class reality with you, who share a certain world view with you. And also, you get intimidated into this thinking, well, maybe that's the real Iranian position. And, in Iran, it's authoritarian or whatever. I mean, what could be, let's face facts here. What could be more authoritarian than a country with 900 military bases around the world that conducted a war of aggression against Iraq 20 years ago and now is conducting a war of aggression against Iran? I mean, for God's sake, it's a war of aggression. What I found, silly about this letter, and it spanks of a kind of ultra leftism, very silly, was the sense of equilibrium, that what Iran is doing is as bad as what the United States. They have been faced with a war of aggression. That's a war crime. Iran did not attack anybody. They got attacked and then they retaliate. That doesn't make two to tango. It's the same kind of people, if they were not so cautious about their virtue, would be attacking Hamas openly, saying, look, Hamas has political prisoners, Hamas executes people who spy for Israel, Hamas has a carceral logic that mimics Israel's, therefore Hamas is as bad as Benjamin Netanyahu. The reason they don't say that is because it would damage their virtue to attack the Palestinians. There are some people who say that, but certainly not the people who signed this letter. On Iran, it's much easier. And it's a matter of scale, in a sense, because the Iranians have a state, whereas the Palestinians don't. But really, if you think of the logic of the argument, why are they not attacking Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front and others for also having prisons?
Yeah. Well, so Navid, before I'm gonna let you go here, but I just want to note that perhaps you should organize a letter among Iranian academics in Iran to print in Farsi in an Iranian outlet in solidarity with American prisoners, because we have the largest prison population in the U.S. I'm sure that would make a huge change in the situation. But Navid Zarrinnal, Tehran-based journalist, any last words on this?
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, just one last thing. I'm against virtue signaling, and if I made a letter like that, it would just be virtue signaling. So I'm gonna leave it to the Americans themselves to do it, and won't intervene.
Well, thank you so much, Navid. We really appreciate you coming on and appreciate your analysis.
Thank you.
Now, Vijay, I want to get into the meat of the piece you wrote. You wrote this really fantastic response to this letter. It's called Against the False Symmetry of the Scissors. And an open letter while Iran resists an illegal war of aggression. It was published at the International People's Assembly website. People can go read it there, and we can put up a screenshot of that article. But in it, you write that this letter plays a politically damaging role and from the global north provides the kind of ideological cover that the U.S. loves. You also add that neutrality or a third space does not exist in the midst of a war of aggression. And you also ask, why direct this intervention against Iran at this moment? Why challenge Iran just when it has the United States and Israel on the back foot? Is it necessary to ask Iran to become perfect before you defend its right to survive? I thought that was really, really well put, but people really should go read your entire piece. But Vijay, can you explain why this letter, you already mentioned a few different aspects of it, but why is it so problematic? Because, some people might say, so what? We're just in solidarity with political prisoners anywhere, including Iran. So what's the problem with this letter? And what do you think the proper response should be at this incredibly violent moment for U.S. empire globally?
Well, I would say the first thing I would say is that it would have been interesting if the very same people had published a letter with this kind of absolute publicity about, let's say, the young people in Britain, because the Guardian is a British newspaper, about the young people in Britain from Palestine Action who were imprisoned by the British state for taking direct action against Zionist Israeli companies that produced weapon systems. Why wasn't there a letter naming those people, those young people, extremely brave people who were British nationals being persecuted by the British state, including British nationals who were protesting on their behalf who were arrested. Why wasn't there a letter for them? Why wasn't there a letter for Palestinian prisoners, 1,400 of them, being brutalized by the Israeli machine in Sted Teman, for instance, which is basically the Auschwitz of this Gaza war? Why aren't those things out there? You see, if somebody says, well, why not? I would say, okay, why not? But why not those things first? Why didn't that happen? Why didn't the Guardian carry a piece attacking Israel's prison system, its detention of minors, minors dying in prisons, minors being picked up not from Gaza, but from the West Bank, from their homes and being thrown. Why not that? Because that doesn't suit their purposes. It suits their purposes when it's necessary to come out there and say, as a soft weapon, while the hard weapons are firing at Iran, it's a soft weapon to say, well, look at them. They deserve the hard weapons because they are themselves problematic. Let's fight for the overthrow of that state. And I find it rather strange when people quote Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' line, workers of the world unite, when it suits them. When it suits them. I mean, why does the phrase take on resonance in this case? What about other cases, where there is not? In this case, the Iranians are fighting for their lives. I mean, they are fighting, as the president of Iran said yesterday, they are fighting to prevent becoming another Venezuela. That's what he said directly. He doesn't want to have to surrender Iran's oil to the United States. Right now, Venezuela's oil is controlled by the US government. The profits are going to the United States. He doesn't want to see that happen because they are fighting to maintain the equilibrium of their society. Of course, things are not good inside Iran right now. It's under attack and has been so since 1979. But look at this. The United States pledges harder economic sanctions just a few days after this letter comes out. Does this letter provoke people to then come out and attack the US sanctions on Iran, saying, the sanctions must end, which is really criminalizing the whole population of Iran? The sanctions must end, but so should the prisoners. I would like to see a follow up letter attacking the US sanctions and then also saying we are against the political prisoners. Where's the follow up letter? At least the Chinese have come out and said, if you actually act on these sanctions, we're going to sanction you. That's a material comeback. That's material solidarity, not just solidarity in words.
Well, Vijay, what's really interesting about what happened here is actually the backlash. Navid mentioned it before. If this had happened during Syria or Libya, it probably would have gone through kind of unnoticed or unchallenged. But there were two interesting, to say that, elements of the backlash. On one hand, a lot of people were shocked, really, by the signature of Mumia Abu-Jamal. This was he's a lifelong fighter for justice, currently a political prisoner, anti-imperialist. And you shared a message that Mumia Abu-Jamal had shared written on paper plates from prison. And I'll read it. My young friends, Iran is showing the world, especially the third world, how to fight against the empire. Their drones are rewriting the rules of war, and countries across the global south are studying this phase of the war for that use. They remind me of Vietnam, poor country that whipped the most powerful army on earth. That's where we are today. Love, Mumia. And, in a lot of ways, this is directly against the sentiment of that Guardian letter. So it calls into question the ethics of the letter in a lot of ways. And, how did Mumia's signature end up there? And then just, before, to add on to this, tell us a little bit about the backlash and what it says about where the anti-imperialist sentiment stands today, and why, this pressure was actually successful in getting people to back off. If you can address those two elements.
Vijay's muted. Hold on, Vijay, you're muted. We're fixing it.
No,
I think
sorry,
it might be.
sorry. That was just a perfect muting. No, I was saying that I've known Mumia Abu-Jamal for 30 years. Our close friend recently died, Joanna Fernandez. I've spoken at events for Mumia. We've been in direct communication. We've written about each other's work. He has published a very fine essay in a book that I edited 10 years ago called Letters to Palestine. This is definitely not a letter that the Mumia Abu Jamal I know would have ever signed and did sign. And I know people who are part of his close committee. I've been in touch with them. They are absolutely adamant that there is no way a signature by him was verified by anybody. And when Robin Kelley, when he released his video and he used the word shady, when he used the word shady to describe the way this letter was put together, it is indeed shady. And I don't understand why the people who wrote the letter don't have the courage to come out in public and say, we wrote the letter, we drafted it, we got the signatures, and here's the email trail of the signatures. They don't have the courage for it. They are hiding in the shadows. Robin Kelley has come out. Several people have come out. There are a number of junior people. I don't want to name them. They themselves, have removed themselves from this letter. Let the people who put them into this position come out and defend the letter and defend the fact that they got signatures. The Guardian, shameful that it published a letter like this without verifying signatures. I'm quite shocked that a newspaper that pretends to be of the highest quality would publish a letter without asking to see verification of signatures. People say we weren't shown the final draft, etc., etc. I think this is a very, very disturbing scenario, and it needs to be investigated. Somebody needs to investigate how such a shambles, was put together. So that's the first thing. Backlash is to be expected. I mean, what do you expect when you sign a letter which is about saying that the two sides are basically equivalent in the middle of a war of aggression? I mean, what do you expect in any other time? Even in after the January protests, when people said, I support the people of Iran, there was no backlash. Okay, you support the people of Iran. Everybody supports them. They are struggling to survive. Prices, inflation is very high, and so on. Of course, we support the people of Iran. That's without a doubt. We don't support, a regime change in Iran, but we support the people of Iran 100%. I think the economic policies, by and large, are not great. I mean, they are running an austerity budget. That's not great. Of course, you can have a criticism and debates and discussions, but now, in the middle of this, your house is on fire, and you're telling me you don't like the color of my wallpaper. I mean, that's ludicrous. That's ludicrous. Like, look at the context. Look at what you are being used for. That's the key thing. You're being used for something, and it creates a lot of confusion among people who should be out there on the streets saying this war must end. I mean, we don't want this war to continue for many reasons. One is, I don't want to see more people suffer in Iran. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see the suffering in the Gulf Arab states. And I certainly don't want to see the Strait of Hormuz inflation, which has been inflicted on the world by the US-Israeli war. I don't want to see that continue. And just on that point, Israel, we now know, thanks to reporting by Maggie Haberman and others, we now know that it was Israel that actually came to the United States and said, look, let's do this. We'll get rid of the Iranian government in no time, regime change, etc. We know that. Where is Israel now? Israel isn't part of any negotiation. The Israelis aren't saying anything. They have disappeared. Once they fail, they recede into the background. They don't take responsibility for what they got the United States into. They have vanished. I don't see any discussion either about Israel or from Israel about this war. They pretend like they had nothing to do with it. It's incredible. Maggie Haberman's book has just come out, Regime Change. There's a whole section where she describes Benjamin Netanyahu inside the Situation Room of the White House. Unprecedented. Have a foreign leader in the Situation Room, giving a presentation about how Mr. Trump will have an easy war in Iran. It didn't go so well. Now he's disappeared. Trump is holding, passing the parcel. The music stopped. Trump has it in his hand.
I mean, it's truly shocking. And with that, Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for joining us here on BT Live. For all of you who have not checked out Vijay's letter, you can find it at IPA/-AIP.org, where Vijay penned this great letter, kind of taking down the other letter. So 2 dueling letters. Check out Vijay's work there. And you can find a lot of his incredible reporting at breakthroughnews.org. He recently penned a piece about the war in Iran and this push, the inevitable choice about the nuclear question. So thank you, Vijay Prashad, for joining us here.
Bye. See you later.